Welcome to the MC3 Executive Podcast. In this episode, we're exploring escalation architecture. Many organizations treat escalation as a process, a procedure, a reporting step, a decision about who needs to know what and when. But escalation is rarely procedural at its core. Escalation is emotional. It reveals how people experience risk, uncertainty, authority, and trust. It shows where confidence exists and where it doesn't. When escalation is inconsistent, organizations become unpredictable. Some teams escalate too early. Others escalate too late. Some avoid escalation altogether. And when pressure rises, these differences become even more visible. The result is organizational drift. Not because people disagree, but because they respond differently to the same signals. The purpose of escalation architecture is to create consistency. Not by introducing more bureaucracy, but by creating a shared understanding of how pressure should move through the organization. Escalation becomes predictable, safe, and aligned. Let's start with a simple observation. People do not escalate issues because of process. They escalate issues because of emotion. Most escalation decisions are psychological long before they become operational. People escalate when uncertainty becomes uncomfortable. When risk feels difficult to manage alone. When something no longer feels safe to contain locally. Likewise, people avoid escalation for emotional reasons. They worry about appearing incompetent. They worry about criticism. They worry about creating pressure. They worry about being blamed for raising concerns. This is why many escalation problems are not process problems. They are safety problems. Teams often know how to escalate. They simply do not feel safe doing so. Escalation architecture is designed to remove that fear. The next challenge involves escalation thresholds. In many organizations, escalation thresholds are assumed rather than defined. One team believes escalation should happen within hours. Another believes it should happen within days. Another waits until a situation becomes critical. Each group believes they are behaving correctly. The problem is that they are working from different assumptions. The MC3 approach replaces assumptions with clarity. Leaders make escalation thresholds visible. People understand when an issue should remain local, when it should be shared, and when it must be elevated immediately. For example, this must rise immediately, not because it is urgent, but because it is ambiguous. Or, this can stay local. Handle it confidently and keep me informed. Or, you do not need permission to escalate uncertainty. These statements reduce hesitation. They remove ambiguity. And they help teams make better decisions under pressure. Of course, culture plays a significant role in escalation behavior. In some cultures, escalation feels collaborative. In others, it feels confrontational. In some regions, escalation may be interpreted as responsibility. In others, it may feel like criticism of local leadership. These differences do not disappear simply because an organization creates a workflow. People bring their cultural experiences into every decision they make. Effective leaders understand this. Rather than forcing uniform behavior, they create shared emotional expectations. Escalation becomes an organizational responsibility rather than a personal judgment. And when that shift occurs, something important happens. Issues surface earlier. Confidence increases. Alignment improves. The organization becomes more resilient. This leads us to the concept of safe escalation. The most mature organizations encourage issues to rise early. Not because they expect problems, but because they understand that uncertainty is easier to manage when it becomes visible. Safe escalation is the ability to surface uncertainty before it becomes risk. Creating that environment requires leadership consistency. Leaders cannot ask for transparency while reacting negatively to bad news. They cannot encourage escalation while appearing impatient or inaccessible. And they cannot celebrate openness while creating fear around mistakes. Safe escalation is built through behavior. One leader transformed her organization with a simple change. Instead of asking, "Why am I only hearing this now?" she began saying, "Thank you. Let's understand it early together." The impact was immediate. Teams became more willing to raise concerns. Issues appeared earlier. And risk became easier to manage. The words changed. But more importantly, the emotional signal changed. During a crisis, escalation becomes even more important. Without clear escalation practices, emotion often spreads faster than information. People begin filling gaps with assumptions. Anxiety increases. Clarity decreases. This is where a crisis escalation script becomes useful. A strong escalation message does four things. It explains what is known. It acknowledges what remains unknown. It defines the emotional posture required. And it explains what should happen next. For example, here's what I know, what I don't know yet, and what decision I need support with. Simple. Clear. Calibrated. The goal is not to remove uncertainty. The goal is to manage uncertainty effectively. When escalation architecture is working well, organizations change. Uncertainty rises earlier. Risk becomes visible sooner. Teams feel safer discussing concerns. Crisis responses become more predictable. And leadership receives better information. Escalation stops being something people fear. It becomes part of the organization's operating rhythm. Consider this example. A team escalates an issue too early. Rather than criticizing them, leadership responds with clarity. This doesn't yet meet the escalation threshold. Escalate when the risk exceeds local control capacity, when customer impact becomes possible, or when timelines slip beyond 48 hours. Everything else stays within your team. Notice what happens. The team receives guidance, not judgment. The threshold becomes clearer. And future escalation becomes more consistent. This week, think about how escalation operates within your organization. Ask yourself, do people know when to escalate? And more importantly, do they feel safe doing it? Because escalation is not really about authority. It is about alignment. And when escalation is aligned, organizations become stronger, faster, and more resilient. Thank you for listening to the MC3 Executive Podcast.